Welcome to Close Listening. I'm Zach Morgenstern, joined as always by silent co-host Ludwig von B. I thought a fun thing to talk about today would be musicians or moments, at least, in which I've confused different musical acts with one another. If these are relatable mistakes to you, you can appreciate it in that way. Or if these are mistakes you are sure you wouldn't have made, you can laugh at my stupidity and appreciate it in that way. So before I get to my top 10, I'm going to start with an honorable mention. This is a mistake I have luckily not made, but I have been caught up in other people's mistakes. So, honorable mention, Red Red Wine. Red Red Wine is a song by one of my favorite singer-songwriters, Neil Diamond, but it was made a huge reggae ska classic by the band UB40 in the 1980s. Now, because it is a song in the reggae tradition, someone who uploads songs to YouTube clearly decided this was a Bob Marley song. So I was unfortunate only in that I'm looking up the song, Red Red Wine, that I love, and I see Bob Marley does a version, and I opened it and I thought, wait a minute, this sounds suspiciously like the UB40 version. And it's because it was the UB40 version. Just some poor soul had convinced themselves or was convinced on tricking all of us into thinking it was Bob Marley. Now down to the mistakes that are truly my own. Number 10, this is a simple one, Too Many Billies. So as a kid, especially before the age of YouTube and streaming, I knew a lot more names of musicians and bands than I actually knew the music associated with them. So growing up in Toronto, I was familiar that there was a band called Billy Talent, and I also heard about the singer called Billy Idol. So just very conceptually similar as names, Billy Idol and Billy Talent. And by the time I finally heard a song by one of them, which was White Wedding by Billy Idol, I couldn't remember for the life of me, was it a Billy Idol song or a Billy Talent song? And I have to repeat to myself, Billy Talent is a band, Billy Idol, single person. Number 9. So recently I was listening to an old mixtape of my father's, and I told him there was this song on it that I think it was a George Michael song, but I didn't recognize it. And he was confused because he was like, I was never into George Michael. I would never put George Michael on a mixtape. And it turns out this was not a George Michael song. It was a song called Moving On Up by a Scottish band called Primal Scream. And I can understand my dad's confusion because when I listen to vocalist Bobby Gillespie's voice, he doesn't really sound like George Michael at all. At the same time, the stylings in the song sound quite similar to George Michael's songs Faith and Freedom 90. So as someone listening to a mixtape with no idea what the musician was, I still think George Michael was a pretty reasonable guess.
Number 8.
So I listen to a radio station that plays a lot of Phil Collins. So when I heard the song that sounded like it was using a lot of drum loops, it used a lot of keyboards, and had a calm, mournful, vaguely high male singing voice, I thought, oh, this is yet another Phil Collins song they're playing all the time. But it turns out it was his former Genesis bandmate, Peter Gabriel.
The song was In Your Eyes.
And I feel like this is one that'll produce an even split of reactions because on the one hand, Phil Collins and Peter Gabriel are contemporaries. They overlapped in that same band, Genesis. And yet Peter Gabriel is seen as a sort of serious experimental world issues kind of singer-songwriter. And Phil Collins is sometimes dismissed as more lightweight commercial pop. So it's kind of interesting how there's so much overlap with these two guys, including that they both lost their hair, but also that they're seen as such culturally different figures in your eyes. Number 7. So this is one that's kind of falsely on the list because, as I said before, I was told that the Bee Gees are a really important band. You can't miss out on their music. I knew vaguely they were a disco act. I could probably have told you at the time their most famous song was Staying Alive. And I got this greatest hits of the Bee Gees album out of the library, and I started listening to it. I'm like, wait a minute. Is there a second band called the Bee Gees? Because this doesn't sound like them. If anything, it sounds like the Beatles. And particularly their song Lonely Days, it vaguely reminds me of the same spirit of All You Need Is Love by the Beatles. Number 6. So that same radio station where they played a lot of Phil Collins, they play a number of songs by a Canadian singer, a Scottish-born Canadian singer named Gowan. Lawrence Gowan is his full name. And I believe now he performs with Styx as a substitute for one of their original band members. The Gowan song they played all the time was this dark, progressive pop song called A Criminal Mind. You know, it's a confession of a dark figure, and it's sung by Gowan in his relatively high voice, and he put dramatic emphasis on certain words to highlight the darkness. Another song sung by a cis male singer with a high voice who puts dramatic emphasis is The Logical Song by Supertramp. It turns out, at least to my ears, their singer, Roger Hodgson, sounds a lot like Gowan. And both Gowan and Supertramp get a lot of play on this Toronto 70s, 80s, 90s station, Boom 97.3, number 5. So again, this is a kind of a fake one. I had a greatest hits of Kiss CD out of the library, and I started listening to one of the tracks, Hard Luck
Woman.
And it didn't sound like anything else Kiss had done on the album. It was much more folky than rock and roll. And the voice also sounded familiar. I thought, wait a minute, is this a Kiss album or is there randomly a Rod Stewart song on here? Now, it turns out this was a Kiss song and it was intentionally written to kind of sound like Rod Stewart. And it was Peter Criss, the drummer, doing the singing. He apparently had this uncanny ability to sing like Rod Stewart. And the fact that it was the drummer singing is the reason it didn't sound like Paul Stanley or Gene Simmons. Number 4, the Hollies and the Kinks. So this may be the example that actually inspired the video, because this is not just one idiosyncratic song causing confusion. These were two bands I had mixed up in my head for a long time. And I guess the reason for this is I always vaguely had the sense that they were big bands of the British invasion, but also not quite as big as the Beatles or the Who or the Rolling Stones. And also I think it's their names, especially to a younger me, felt a bit abstract. They weren't a clear concept like the Animals or the Zombies or the Small Faces or Herman's Hermits. And I think to top off the confusion, the first song I learned by either of these bands is Long Cool Woman, which is a Hollies song, but it starts with a sort of punky, power chordy, bassliney riff. So it sounds kind of like the Kinks classic song, Girl, You
Really got me.
And it doesn't really sound like other things by the Hollies. Now, are these bands actually that similar? Not really. The Kinks are known for their 4-person lineup, whereas the Hollies had a more fluid identity through the years. The Hollies were sort of 50-50 with covers and original songs, whereas the Kinks were really a band of original songs. But as for sort of bands on the middle of the fame tree in the British invasion, I guess that's why I got them confused. Number 3. So this is an interesting one. I remember hearing this tune played on the radio at some point and I didn't hear what it was called, and I was really annoyed because it sounded like a Rolling Stones song and I wanted to know what it was. And it had this absolutely memorable little violin riff. And I was really annoyed because this song was stuck in my head and I didn't think I was ever going to hear it again. Luckily, the song turned out to be pretty famous. It was not the Rolling Stones. It was a band called The Verve, and the song was called Bittersweet Symphony. Now, there is an interesting Rolling Stones connection with this one. Namely, the song samples an orchestral bit from this album that did orchestral renditions of Rolling Stones songs. And there was a whole IP drama because the Verve legally got the rights to sample this bit from the orchestral album. But because they didn't get the rights from the Rolling Stones directly, the Rolling Stones manager decided to be all Machiavellian and business savvy and give the Verve a hard time and insist on giving Mick Jagger and Keith Richards a writing credit, even though this violin bit that the Verve was sampling sounded very little like the original Rolling Stones song, The Last Time. It's not like Mick and Keith put any effort into the Verve's composition. But so what's fascinating for me is that there is this very loose Rolling Stones connection with the song. But for whatever reason, I just thought the Verve's lead singer sounded like Mick Jagger. I guess it's just something about that English accent to my American ears. Number 2. This one should feel more embarrassing because these are two famous bands, and these are two bands I absolutely heard of and knew some of the songs by when I heard the song. But simply put, when I first heard Should I Stay or Should I Go by The Clash, I guess something about its energy reminded me enough of Satisfaction by the Rolling Stones that for the longest time, I thought this pretty famous song by The Clash was a pretty famous song by the Rolling Stones. And finally, number 1. Way back in 2012, 2013, I'd be walking through HMV looking for CDs in Toronto, and this song kept coming on the radio. And its beat, as well as the little bit of grit in the voice of the lead singer, made me convinced this is a Creedence Clearwater song. It sounds a bit like Bad Moon Arising. Eventually, because the song did turn out to be pretty famous, I discovered it was not Creedence Clearwater Revival. It was Hall & Oates singing what has come to be their most famous song, You Make My Dreams Come True. And this is another interesting one because Hall and Oates and CCR aren't generally bands that you would confuse because CCR is seen as roots and authentic bluesy rock, whereas Hall and Oates are sometimes dismissed as commercial pop. It's that Peter Gabriel, Phil Collins thing all over again, where branding can make one artist look so much more serious than another. But the truth is they have very similar talents. There's only so many chords, only so many rhythms in the Western imagining. So let me know in the comments below if you've ever confused any artists or you've heard a song and thought for years it was by one artist and by another. I'm sure any anecdotes you can add will only make this experience more fun for everyone. I'm Zach Morgenstern. This is Ludwig von B. See you next time.